for the hardest-hitting show in talk radio. The true progressive voice since 2012. This is Southpaws.
And welcome to Southpaws on the Pacifica Radio Network. We are the leaders of the revolution. I'm Darren Gibson, your host. Donald Trump wins the Republican caucus in Iowa, which is no big surprise. There was a big surprise according to a new entrance poll by NBC News. We'll get into that in just a little bit. Trump is at the E. Jean Carroll trial. We'll tell you what's happening there. He's getting in trouble with the judge because he can't keep his mouth shut. Plus, we have to talk about the latest happenings in Ottawa County. Apparently, there might be a movement to oust Supervisor John Gibbs, Mr. Whale Feces himself. We'll talk about that. That is the latest update on that. That's very surprising. I doubt that they'll get rid of him, and I'll tell you why in just a little bit. Before we start with today's topics, a couple reminders. You can follow us on social media by going to facebook.com/Southpaws Radio Show. You can follow us on X, the former Twitter, at Southpaws Radio. You can follow us on Tumblr at southpawsradioshow.tumblr.com. You can follow us on YouTube and Mastodon by doing a search for Southpaws Radio. You can become a patron of the show by going to patreon.com/Southpaws Radio. You can listen to the show anytime at Apple Podcasts, Spreaker, Google Podcasts, Podcast Addict, Podvine, and Pandora by doing a search for Southpaws. Once you found our logo, you found us. We send links to our weekly episodes to our Facebook, X, Tumblr, YouTube, and Mastodon accounts. You can listen to us on Global Community Radio Channel 1 every Saturday night at 11 Eastern. And you can listen to us on great Pacifica stations, including KCEI in Taos, New Mexico, and KZGM in Kabul, Missouri. Be sure to listen to us on your local Pacifica affiliate. We apologize to all of you for not recording a show last week. We were getting ready to hunker down for the storm of the year, probably the storm of the decade. Who knows with the way the climate change is going. We're still digging out from about a foot of snow here at the studios in Michigan, just north of Grand Rapids. Grand Rapids got it worse. They are digging out from about a foot and a half of snow. It continues to still snow in the area here, and it's bone-chilling cold. It's colder than my ex-wife's heart. That's pretty cold. So hopefully the temperatures, they're calling for a warm-up next week. We're talking mid-30s possibly. I hope it comes true. We could use some sunshine. We've seen the sun out today. We're recording the show on Wednesday, January 17th, 2024. We've seen some sunshine today, but it doesn't do any good because it's so cold up here. And the problem is that the polar air is coming down too far because there's not enough ice in the Arctic. When all that ice is melted, you start getting shifts in the jet stream, which means your winter weather is going to come further to the south. That's why Tennessee has snow, 6 inches of snow, at least 6 inches in Kentucky. Bone-chilling weather in Texas. There have been slide-offs in Houston. I've seen the videos, and it's just amazing that Texas is just like this. And for that matter, most of the United States is in a death grip of cold right now. Again, it's supposed to warm up in the next week or so, but we'll see what happens. But these winters are going to continue getting worse and worse and worse because of climate change. Now, you know the conservatives are going to say, well, it snowed a foot. You know, that's proof that there's no such thing as climate change. Really? No, that just proves that there is climate change. Because, like I said, all the ice up in the Arctic has melted. Therefore, the jet streams go further to the south and pull that cold air further to the south and bring snow and ice and all the dangerous conditions. When you've got people dying in Tennessee from the cold and the weather, that's really something. That's something to behold. So hopefully we'll get back to some halfway decent weather in the area here. Let's go ahead and get into our topics for today. Donald Trump won Iowa. Not a big surprise. But there was a statistic that was brought up on NBC News the other night that really got my attention. This was an entrance poll at the Iowa GOP caucus. This was the question asked. If Donald Trump is convicted, is he fit to be president? 64% of respondents said yes, 31% no, 5% undecided. Now just think about that. You have 64 out of every 100 people at this caucus. These are Republicans that are supporting a Republican candidate, whether it was Donald Trump, whether it was Nikki Haley, whether it was Florida Governor Ron death sentence. It doesn't matter. 6 out of 10, or a little more than 6 out of 10, said that if Trump is convicted, he is fit to be president. That is a scary thought. That is absolutely horrifying. Where have we gone in this country? I'm not even surprised by this statistic. I'm astonished by it. What happened to all the thinking people in this country? Did they just go away? What happened to the quote-unquote smart conservative? Did they really exist? Did they ever exist? I'm telling you, folks, these people are brainwashed. They're in a cult. They're just like the Nazis in the 1930s. Everybody in Germany back then said, oh, Hitler's not a big problem. Oh, we can handle Hitler. Hitler's for us. Hitler's going to do great things for us. And he did great things for the German people. Ask the Jews how they feel about Hitler. 6 million Jews exterminated in a genocide by Adolf Hitler and his henchmen. 20 million people total. People who resisted, again, the Jews, the gypsies, anybody that was queer, wiped out because they weren't the pure German blood. You know, Donald Trump has talked about that the immigrants coming in, the migrants coming in from the South are ruining the blood of Americans. And, you know, you get some of these supporters of Donald Trump that say, well, you know what he means by that? He means that he's talking about all these illegal drugs coming in, this fentanyl that's killing all of our citizens. Really? No, I know better. He's talking about white supremacy because Donald Trump is a white supremacist. He is a racist. He is a rapist and a racist. Sorry? I'm just telling the truth. But 64% of Iowans going into the Republican caucus said that Donald Trump was fit to be president even if he was convicted. And that's convicted of January 6th crimes, I am assuming. This is scary. This really is super scary. It just horrifies me. It's astonishing. It really is, folks. Where have we gone wrong in this country? I can tell you where we've gone wrong. Started with Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan starting in on liberals. And then Rush Limbaugh chimed in, libtards, feminazis, and it's gotten worse ever since. Fox Propaganda Channel came about, and that really got everything rolling. I tell you what, progressive media, like Southpaws, doesn't stand a chance against these big corporations like Salem Broadcasting that have Dennis Prager on, and they have Hugh Hewitt. We don't stand a chance. That's why I started a Patreon account. That's why I've asked for people to donate to our Patreon, to become patrons of our show. Support your local Pacifica affiliate. Even if they're not doing a fundraiser right now, if your local Pacifica affiliate, if it's something that you enjoy listening to, please donate your time, donate your money to them, because they're the ones providing the voices of truth right now. You're not getting it from your local news. You're not getting it from the national news services. You're certainly not getting it from Fox Propaganda Channel or Newsmax or OAN or whatever. What's the one? The Epoch Times. Let me tell you about this. The Epoch Times has been advertising heavily on billboards in the Grand Rapids, Michigan area. Why are they doing this? It's because they're trying to get new listeners and new viewers for their articles. They're trying to get new hits on their website. And people are just so stupid that they don't think and internalize maybe this is propaganda. They don't see it as propaganda because they see a title, the Epoch Times. Oh, that must be a newspaper. It isn't. It's conservative garbage. And the thing is that there's a lot of halfway smart people that have been brainwashed so deeply by their conservative politics that they don't know any better. They don't know better. And we have to stop them. One way or another, we got to stop them. We got to educate these people. I swear to God, I have been one of the biggest supporters of this. There needs to be at least 2 hours every night on national television where you get history lessons. And not just the history lessons that the Republicans want you to listen to. Oh, no. You're going to get the truth. You're going to get the hard truth. You're going to hear about what we did to the Indians, the Native Americans, by putting them in schools and raping them and killing them, making them give up their language to learn the white man language. That's the kind of history I want to see. I want to see the Tulsa Massacre taught. I want to see every dark piece of U.S. history taught so that we never do this again. The problem is we're going to repeat history because we haven't learned from it. We really, truly haven't. I mean, 64% of caucus goers going into the Iowa caucus said that Donald Trump is fit to be president even if he's convicted of a crime. What does that tell you about our society when you've got those kind of numbers? Really, I don't know. I don't know what this is going to lead to. I tell you what, we've got an update. Speaking of Donald Trump, he is at the E. Jean Carroll trial right now. I guess it's a testimony that's going on in New York. We've got this story from the Associated Press. This is Michael R. Sizak, Larry Neumeister, and Jake Offenhart's writing. This is dated January 17th out of New York. Donald Trump was threatened with expulsion from his Manhattan civil trial Wednesday after he repeatedly ignored a warning to keep quiet while writer E. Jean Carroll testified that he shattered her reputation after she accused him of sexual abuse. Judge Louis A. Kaplan told Trump that his right to be present at the trial will be revoked if he remains disruptive. After an initial warning, Carroll's lawyers said Trump could still be heard making remarks to his lawyers, including, quote, "It is a witch hunt," end quote, and, quote, "It really is a con job," end quote. In an exchange after the jury was excused for lunch, Kaplan said, quote, "Mr. Trump, I hope I don't have to consider excluding you from the trial. I understand you're probably eager for me to do that," end of quote. Trump shot back, quote, "I would love it," end of quote. Unbelievable. And he did this while shrugging his shoulders as he sat between his lawyers Alina Habba and Michael Medallo at the defense table. Kaplan responded, quote, "I know you would like it. You just can't control yourself in this circumstance, apparently," end quote. Trump muttered, quote, "You can't either," end quote. At that point, if I was the judge, I'd just drop contempt on him and he'd be going to jail for 72 hours. I'd drop the hammer on that orange son of a bitch. This is what you need to do. This is how you get his attention. That's the only way you're going to stop him is by punishing him. Period. End of story. Afterward, Trump ripped Kaplan on social media while the judge denied a request that he step aside from the case. In a Truth Social post, Trump described the Bill Clinton appointee as, quote, seething and hostile, end quote, and abusive, rude, and obviously not impartial, end quote. Kaplan cracked down after Carroll lawyer Sean Crowley complained for a second time that Trump could be heard, quote, loudly saying things that are false, end quote, as he sat at the defense table, frequently tilting back in his chair and leaning over to speak with his lawyer. Among his comments, Crowley said were that the longtime Elle magazine advice columnist was lying about the assault and that she seemed to have, quote, gotten her memory back, end quote. Crowley suggested that if Carroll's lawyers could hear Trump from where they were sitting about 12 feet from him, jurors might have been able to hear him too. Before the jurors returned to the courtroom after a morning break, Kaplan said, quote, I'm just going to ask that Mr. Trump take special care to keep his voice down when conferring with counsel to make sure the jury does not hear it, end quote. Earlier, without the jury in the courtroom, Trump could be seen slamming his hand on the defense table and uttering the word man when the judge again refused his lawyer's request that the trial be suspended on Thursday so he could attend his mother-in-law's funeral in Florida. I'd check that casket, too, to see if there were documents in it. Trump, fresh from a win Monday in the Iowa caucuses, has made his various legal fights part of his campaign. He sat in on jury selection Tuesday, then jetted to a New Hampshire rally before returning to court Wednesday. Last week, he attended closing arguments in the New York Attorney General's fraud lawsuit against him, and defying that judge, gave a 6-minute diatribe after his lawyer spoke. The 80-year-old Carroll was the first witness in a Manhattan federal court trial to determine damages, if any, that Trump owes her for remarks he made while he was president in June 2019, as he vehemently denied ever attacking her or knowing her. A jury last year already found that Trump sexually abused her in 1996 and defamed her when he made a round of denials in October 2022. Carroll's appearance, which continued Wednesday afternoon, was somewhat of a tightrope walk because of limitations the judge has posed on the trial in light of the previous verdict and prior rulings he's made restricting the infusion of political talk into the proceedings. Haba lobbed multiple objections seeking to prevent the jury from hearing details of Carroll's sexual assault allegations. Referencing the damage she said Trump had caused to her reputation, Carroll said, quote, I've paid just about as dearly as it's possible to pay, end of quote. She said that Trump's vitriol toward her has not ceased, pointing to multiple social media posts he made about her in recent days, and that his rhetoric continues to inspire venom against her from strangers because she claimed he sexually abused her decades ago. On Truth Social on Tuesday, Trump said Carroll's, quote, fabricated lies, end of quote, were, quote, attempted extortion, end quote, and he spelled extortion in all capital letters. Carroll said, quote, he lied last month, he lied on Sunday, he lied yesterday, and I am here to get my reputation back, end of quote. Carroll said she worries about her personal safety after a stream of death threats led her to buy bullets for a gun she inherited from her father, install an electronic fence, warn her neighbors of threats, and unleash her pit bull to roam freely on the property of the small cabin in the mountains of upstate New York where she lives alone. She also brought security along for the trial this week and last May, and said she'd often thought about hiring security more often to accompany her. Her attorney, Roberta Kaplan, no relation to the judge, asked her, quote, why don't you, end of quote. Carroll answered, quote, can't afford it, end of quote. She took the stand after a hostile encounter between Haba and Kaplan, culminating in Trump's desk slam over the judge's refusal to adjourn the trial on Thursday so Trump could attend the funeral for Melania Trump's mother, Amalia Knavas, who died last week. Haba called the judge's ruling, quote, insanely prejudicial, end of quote, and the judge soon after cut her off, saying he would, quote, hear no further argument on it, end quote. Haba told the judge, quote, I will not be spoken to that way, Your Honor, end quote. When she mentioned the funeral again, the judge responded, quote, it's denied, sit down, bring in the jury, end of quote. Carol's testimony came 9 months after she was in the same chair convincing a jury in the hopes that Trump could be held accountable in a way that would stop him from frequent verbal attacks against her as he campaigns for president. I'm looking at a picture of him right now. What the hell has he got on his hand? It looks like blood. Well, he's got the blood of a lot of people on his hands. About 1 million of them from the death of COVID. She said, quote, "I'm here because Donald Trump assaulted me, and when I wrote about it, he said it never happened. He lied and shattered my reputation," end of quote. Carol testified that once she was a respected advice columnist, quote, "Now I'm known as the liar, the fraud, and the whack job," end quote. Carol said Trump's repeated smears cost her millions of readers and her Ask E. Jean advice column, which ran in Elle for more than 25 years. The magazine has said her contract wasn't renewed for unrelated reasons. Oh, really? Bullshit! Because the first jury found that Trump sexually abused Carol in the 1990s and then defamed her in 2022, the new trial concerns only how much more, if anything, he'll be ordered to pay her for other remarks he made in 2019 while he was president. Carol accused Trump of forcing himself on her in a dressing room after a chance meeting at a luxury department store near Trump Tower in 1996. She alleges that he then publicly impugned her honesty, her motives, and even her sanity after she told the story publicly in a 2019 memoir. Trump asserts that nothing ever happened between him and Carol and that he never met her. He says a 1987 party photo of them and their then spouses doesn't count because it was a momentary greeting. Oh, really? It doesn't count. Wow. Delusional. Cuckoo. Have I got the cuckoo on here? Yes, I do. Totally delusional. Trump did not attend the previous trial in the case last May when a jury found he had sexually abused and defamed Carol and awarded her $5 million in damages. The jury said, however, that Carol hadn't proved her claim that Trump raped her. Carol is now seeking $10 million in compensatory damages and millions more in punitive damages. The Associated Press typically does not name people who say they've been sexually assaulted until they come forward publicly, as Carol has done. So there you go, folks. That's the latest between Trump's feud with E. Jean Carroll. Hopefully she wins. I'm just going to call it like it is. I hope she wins. I hope she bankrupts him. If the state of New York doesn't bankrupt him before then. This is beautiful. All billionaires ought to be bankrupted. All of them. Take all their wealth away from them. I'm sorry. Take it all. The hoarding of wealth is a mental illness. Just like the hoarding of anything else is a mental illness. Oh, my God. It's unbelievable. All right, let's get to our next story. This has to do with the conservative group in Ottawa County, Michigan, known as Ottawa Impact. This is Sarah Leach writing for the Holland Sentinel. This is dated January 16th. There's a bit of a twist to this. Listen to this, folks. The headline reads, Gibbs warns of consequences should OI attempt to fire him. This is kind of strange. I figured they were in love with each other. Is the Ottawa County Board of Commissioners already souring on its new administrator? In an email to board chair Joe Moss on Monday, January 15th, an attorney representing John Gibbs warned should the board's meeting Tuesday, January 16th, quote, involve any discussion of changing Mr. Gibbs's employment status with Ottawa County, know that it's our intention to ensure the provisions of my client's employment contract are followed in strict order, end of quote. That is from Gibbs' attorney Aaron Davis of the firm Butzel Long, and that was addressed to Joe Moss. The email was given to the Holland Sentinel by a source close to but not authorized to speak on the matter. The letter came ahead of a planned closed session Tuesday, quote, to consult with corporate counsel regarding trial or settlement strategy in connection with Kimball versus County of Ottawa, end of quote. On October 24th, Ryan Kimball, a finalist for an executive aide position to Gibbs, sued in Ottawa County's 20th Circuit Court alleging age discrimination by Gibbs when the administrator hired a younger candidate, 23-year-old Jordan Epperson, who had fewer qualifications than the county required in its job posting. During a termination hearing for Ottawa County Health Officer Adeline Hambley, who is also suing the board, commissioners heard testimony from former Deputy Administrator Patrick Waterman, as well as current Human Resources Director Marcy Verbeek, in which they described concerning behavior when Epperson was interviewed. Waterman testified during the proceeding, quote, "To my recollection, Mr. Epperson raised support for Ottawa Impact in his interviews," end of quote. Ottawa Impact, founded by Moss in 2021, is a far-right fundamentalist group formed in response to school mask mandates during the COVID-19 pandemic. Ottawa Impact now holds a 7-seat majority on the 11-member board. The Sentinel reported in early September that heavily redacted emails from Verbeek to Gibbs and Waterman indicated differences of opinion as to who should have been offered the job. In the emails, Gibbs told Verbeek on June 15th to make an offer to Epperson. The next day, Verbeek asked for an additional meeting with the hiring committee, quote, "to discuss options prior to moving forward with the hiring process," end of quote. Her statements were almost entirely redacted by Corporation Counsel. Only 2 sentences were released of the 2-page email, along with a chart showing Epperson's qualifications as they compared to the other finalist, Kimball. Of the 5 mandatory criteria the county sought, Epperson had only 1, a bachelor's degree. Kimball holds a master's degree, has experience in strategic management, made the dean's list for both his bachelor's and master's programs, has experience working at the international nonprofit level, has served at least 2 years on a major board, and has experience in management and finance. When asked if Gibbs mentioned Epperson's age and bossing him around, a fact Kimball alleges in his lawsuit, Waterman testified the comment, quote, "was made in the first interview when we asked Gibbs what it was about Mr. Epperson that he liked. We all said age shouldn't make a difference," end of quote. After the board emerged from the approximately 45-minute closed session Tuesday, there was no mention of Gibbs. Moss made a motion to enter mediation with Kimball's attorney, then moved to create a subcommittee of commissioners to advise the mediation negotiations. Moss designated himself chair of the subcommittee and appointed OI-BAT Commissioner Sylvia Rodea, the co-founder of Ottawa Impact, and Gretchen Cosby to the group. An attorney representing Kimball told the Holland Sentinel late last month the settlement discussions had been initiated, but did not disclose details. He said he was unaware the board was considering mediation. Kimball's attorney, Rob Howard of the firm Cunningham Dahlman, said, quote, "We were unaware this was on the agenda, but look forward to the possibility of mediation which may be able to resolve Mr. Kimball's claims without the time and cost of drawn-out litigation," end of quote. He wrote to Moss, quote, "As you know, and your lawyer should know, there's no basis to terminate my client for cause. Should the board or its lawyers attempt to get creative in that vein, be advised that the full extent of legal options available to Mr. Gibbs will be used to ensure the board ceases to violate Mr. Gibbs's constitutional, statutory, and contractual rights any further than it already has to date," end of quote. Gibbs, who was hired on January 3rd, 2023, has a clause in his contract that says that, quote, "he may be terminated at any time for cause defined as intentional fraud, dishonesty, gross misconduct, or willful malfeasance in connection with his performance," end of quote. However, the board may also fire him without cause if they provide a 90-day written notice. If the board were to fire Gibbs, he would receive a lump sum severance payment of 9 months' pay as well as 9 months of health insurance. If he were to be terminated for cause, he would receive no severance, according to the contract. Davis said his firm is conducting its own investigation and that he plans to send a follow-up letter to the board by January 24th, which, quote, "will fully reveal the conclusion of our investigation and the facts and the board's and perhaps others' violations of law against Mr. Gibbs," end of quote. Wow, so it seems like the honeymoon is over in Ottawa County. Oh, boy. The letter continues, quote, "If it is indeed the board's intentions to relieve Mr. Gibbs of his position as county administrator, we will submit a settlement offer in our follow-up letter to lay out my client's terms as it relates to a financial resolution to include a release from liability. To be clear, there is no scenario where the board's adverse conduct against Mr. Gibbs is not put under a microscope by a court of competent jurisdiction if it does not regain its senses and begin treating Mr. Gibbs with dignity," end of quote. Davis was out of the office Tuesday, according to a staff member at his firm. He did not immediately respond to an emailed request for comment. By the way, Gibbs's contract runs through January 3rd, 2026. So there it is, folks. The honeymoon is over in Ottawa County. This is beautiful stuff. Oh, boy. I wonder what the cause behind all this is. While we're talking about Ottawa County, let's get to our next story here. This is Greg Jaffe writing for the Washington Post. This is dated December 23rd. We were going to get to this 2 weeks ago on the show, but we ran out of time. This is out of West Olive, Michigan. All year, the new conservative Christian majority on the Ottawa County Board of Commissioners had been searching for a way to get rid of Adeline Hambley, who ran the West Michigan County's health department. It wasn't as easy as it seemed. They had discussed firing Hambley, who they saw as an instrument of government tyranny, but her job came with protections written into state law that were intended to insulate her from political influence or retribution. They had proposed paying Hambley $4 million to leave. She accepted in early November, but the commissioners backed out a few days later when they learned that the payment could damage the county's bond rating and tank its finances. So there's the story behind that. Now it was November 14th. The commissioners huddled with their lawyers in a windowless conference room at the county's boxy brick government complex. Hambley and her lawyer waited anxiously in a small room just down the hall. The two sides were stuck. All over the country, deep partisan divisions were making it harder for American government to function and its citizens to coexist. The number of intractable disputes seemed to grow by the day. Climate change, racial equity, gender-affirming care, guns, immigration, abortion. The battles were paralyzing Congress and pitting red and blue states against each other. Increasingly, they were consuming school boards and local government. In Ottawa County, a fast-growing community of 300,000 along Lake Michigan, the nexus for so many of these ideological fights was the health department. The hard-right Republicans on the 11-person county board swept into office last year after defeating more moderate GOP incumbents in a primary. The old commissioners had for years focused on keeping taxes low and the county's biggest multinational employers happy. Their replacements reflected an increasingly populist and conspiratorial GOP remade in the image of Donald Trump. They complained that they couldn't trust Hambley. They accused her of supporting mask mandates and pushing coronavirus vaccines that they believed were unproven and possibly unsafe. They said her employees had encouraged dangerous sexually perverse behavior by attending a local pride festival, where they tested attendees for sexually transmitted diseases and administered the Mpox vaccine. Hambley insisted that her job wasn't to serve the board. It was her responsibility to look after the health and safety of all the county's residents, regardless of their moral or political beliefs. The 44-year-old who has sued the county to keep her position said, quote, "I want to work with the commissioners so we can protect the community, but I am not their subordinate," end of quote. Their latest fruitless negotiating session was approaching the 7-hour mark in November 14th when Doug Zylstra, the lone Democrat on the board and a strong backer of Hambley, suggested an option that only a few days earlier would have seemed unthinkable. What if Hambley and the conservatives on the board tried to negotiate a temporary truce? No one was completely comfortable with the idea, but none of the commissioners rejected it. After a half hour of talks, the commissioners had cobbled together a bare-bones proposal that would allow Hambley to keep her job and pay her about $100,000 to cover her legal fees. Zylstra sensed that Hambley would not accept it. She wanted the commissioners to acknowledge her independence and authority as county health officer. She needed guarantees that they wouldn't bully her staff or simply try to fire her again in a few weeks. Still, Zylstra saw the board's offer as a small step forward, a rare glimmer of hope in an otherwise depressing and divisive year for the board and the county. The stalemate was finally forcing the two sides to wrestle with a question that for 11 months they had been unwilling to even consider. Amid all the rancor, could they somehow figure out a way to live together? The driving force behind the year-long effort to remove Hambley was Joe Moss, a 38-year-old newcomer to politics and the board chair. Moss rarely talked about the actual work of county government, repairing roads, maintaining parks, inspecting restaurants, and collecting taxes. Instead, his public statements and social media posts described an epochal battle between Christian conservatives and power secular forces in the media, academia, government, and the medical establishment that he said were trying to outlaw his faith and seize control of his community. In the midst of the board's standoff with Hambley and the health department, Moss wrote, quote, "Censorship, demonization, and public intimidation of conservatives have been the go-to method to obtain submission and silence." End of quote. Really? No, that's the that's the tactics you conservative bastards have been using all year long. A few days later, he shared a post that said, quote, "Progressives are working hard to make unapologetic conservative Christianity unacceptable in the public life of our nation. This is absolutely true." End of quote. Hey, I'm not against any of that. I think Christianity is the bane of society. You want the honest truth? A matter of fact, all religion is the bane of society. People would get along better if we followed John Lennon's song, Imagine. Imagine there's no religion. There you go, folks. There you go. Moss's posts echoed the messages he and his constituents were hearing regularly from their pastors on Sunday, and they mirrored the increasingly angry and apocalyptic rhetoric of national Republican leaders like Trump, who described his political enemies as vermin, often training his ire on the federal bureaucracy and its institutions. Trump said, quote, "Either the deep state destroys America or we destroy the deep state." End of quote. In Ottawa County, Moss's battle began with the 100-person health department. Hours after taking office on January 3rd, Moss and his allies on the board voted to demote Hambley and replace her with Nate Kelly, a safety manager at a local HVAC company who had gained prominence as a vaccine skeptic and critic of mask mandates. The previous Republican-dominated board had appointed Hambley to her position in December 2022 after a months-long nationwide search. They saw Hambley as a long-serving, reliable county employee. To Moss, she was a cog in a vast and unelected bureaucracy that included the World Health Organization, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. Moss declined to comment for this article, like he has with every other article by every other legitimate news source, but discussed the department's importance in an interview with a local right-wing talk radio host. Moss told him, quote, "In many ways, public health has been weaponized in the United States and outside the country, and that's why we need people who are going to prioritize freedom and the Constitution." Really? We should not have top-down governmental control making daily decisions for hundreds of thousands or millions of people. End of quote. Hambley sued the board in February to stop the conservative commissioners from demoting or replacing her, so Moss looked for other ways of limiting her and the department's power. In late August, Moss and the county administrator gave Hambley less than 3 days to slash the department's proposed 2024 budget in half, from $17.4 million to $9 million. The order came despite the county's growing tax revenue and flush coffers. Hambley said she tried to comply but quickly concluded it was not feasible. In news releases and public statements, she warned that the cuts would damage the county's economy, endanger public safety, and trigger a state takeover of the department. Moss and the board gradually backed off their most extreme demands. In late September, the commissioners authorized the department to spend $14.4 million in 2024, down about 20% from the previous year's spending. On the night the budget passed, Moss accused Hambley of, quote, "inciting fear and panic in the community," end of quote, with her warnings, and initiated the formal process to fire her. State law required the board to prove in a public hearing that Hambley was incompetent or had committed malfeasance. Current and former county employees testified over 2 days in late October about the chaotic budget process and the growing political pressure on county workers. When the hearing was done, the county's lawyers warned the commissioners that voting to fire Hambley carried risks. a judge could order the county to reinstate her and pay damages. Moss and his allies on the board debated their options for several days before the two sides reconvened on November 6th at the county government center. They first offered Hambley $1.8 million to leave and drop her lawsuit. Hambley and her attorney countered with $8 million, according to court documents. The back-and-forth negotiations continued for several hours. Near the end of the day, Hambley and her lawyer said they would take $4.5 million to leave, though she didn't expect the board to accept. The county's lawyers advised the commissioners that the proposed settlement was on the high end of what she might receive if she prevailed at trial. Hambley's annual salary and benefits amounted to about $180,000. Several commissioners who wanted to keep Hambley in the job argued that the offer was exorbitant and unnecessary. A majority of the commissioners, though, wanted her gone. The final decision on the proposed settlement fell to Moss. He had been saying for months that the nation's survival required unapologetic conservative leaders with spines of steel. Now the moment had arrived for him to show he was that kind of leader. Moss told the attorneys that he, quote, was willing to pay a premium, end of quote, to guarantee Hambley's departure, according to several people in the room. Sylvia Rodea, the board's vice chair, suggested one last counter of $4 million. Moss agreed. Soon the lawyers were walking the offer down the hall where Hambley and her attorney were waiting. Hambley had gone to the county government complex on the morning of November 6, expecting that she would spend the day fighting to keep her job. She wasn't sure what to do when she saw the board's $4 million counteroffer. She texted her husband, quote, I don't want to feel like I'm selling my soul in some way, end of quote. The daughter of a machinist and a school bus driver, Hambley was the first in her family to graduate from college. She had started with the county 2 decades earlier as a restaurant and septic inspector, working her way up to the department's top job while raising 3 children who are now 19, 17, and 12. That day, her husband was at their home, a small muddy farm with chickens, goats, and a pig named Waffles, who weighed several hundred pounds and slept in their front entryway. She texted him, quote, it's life-changing for our family. What do you want me to do? End of quote. He told her to listen to her lawyer. Hambley accepted the proposed settlement, and the lawyers began working to finalize the language so that the commissioners could reconvene in a week and vote publicly on it. A few days later, the deal fell apart. The county's lawyers told the board that the large payout could cause its insurer to drop the county's coverage, according to several commissioners who spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss internal discussions. The county, in turn, could lose its AAA bond rating, driving up the costs that it, along with schools and townships throughout Ottawa, would incur to borrow money. The county's lawyers emailed Hambley's attorney on November 10th to say they had run into problems with the settlement. On November 14th, everyone returned to the government center for another day of haggling. The board offered Hambley $1 million to quit, the maximum its lawyers said the county could give her without putting its bond rating at risk. Hambley rejected it. The board floated Zylstra's idea of a truce in which the board would pay some of Hambley's legal fees. She would drop her lawsuit and stay in the job without any protections. She turned down that proposal as well. About 4 p.m., the talks ended for the day. Hambley headed to the health department to address her employees, nurses, social workers, health inspectors, and epidemiologists who had packed the office's main conference room. Many were wearing T-shirts bearing the slogan, "Nevertheless, she persisted," in support of their boss. To Moss and his supporters, Hambley was the vanguard of a national movement that was seeking to marginalize and silence Christian conservatives. To employees at the health department, she was their shield. She was fighting not just for them, but for embattled medical professionals across the state and the country. The Holland Sentinel, the local newspaper, had published the details of the $4 million deal a few days earlier before it had been withdrawn. For the workers in the room, the news that Hambley was willing to take money to leave was a gut punch. Some said they had felt abandoned and betrayed. Hambley told employees that she wanted to stay and fight. She said, quote, I would love to keep being the county health officer, end of quote. But a majority of the commissioners were determined to get rid of her. If the board fired her, Hambley told her staff, she probably would have to fight for a year or longer in court before she could return to her job. Even if she prevailed, there were no guarantees that a judge would order the board to reinstate her. Hambley and Marcia Mansoray, her deputy, described the proposed $4 million settlement as a powerful deterrent that would clarify state law and send a message to other county commissions in Michigan that removing a health officer carried huge costs. The employees began to ask questions. They wanted to know who would protect them if both Hambley and Mansoray were gone. Hambley replied that Gwen Unziker, a physician who served as the department's medical director, would fight to make sure their work met the standards of care. They asked Hambley what she was hearing from the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, which had oversight responsibilities for the department. Initially, state officials had pressed Hambley to try to, quote, find common ground, end of quote, with the new commissioners. Later, the response from state officials had been silence, she told the workers. They asked about the HVAC safety manager whom the board hoped to put in charge of their department if Hambley departed. There wasn't much she could tell them. The hour-long session was nearing its end. An employee in the medical examiner's office told Hambley, quote, I can't imagine what you're feeling right now. Thank you for being willing to fight for us, end of quote. Hambley and Mansoray thanked their employees for their perseverance and tenacity. The room burst into applause that lasted for a couple of minutes. When the cheering died down, the workers headed home. They described their state of mind in interviews as anxious, uncertain, stressed, and utterly exhausted. Most doubted that Moss or his allies on the board would be willing to seek an acceptable compromise. Eventually, they would find a way to force Hambley out. Unziker said, quote, to them, the stakes are eternal. There's no middle ground. They seem to think what we're doing is evil, end of quote. News of the scuttled $4 million settlement spread quickly through the county. A few hours after Hambley had addressed her staff, the Ottawa County Patriots held a previously scheduled seminar at a local church. It was titled, The Second Amendment, Under Attack and Fighting Back. Rebecca Curran, one of the new commissioners who had taken office in January, sat in the third pew from the front. When the presentation ended, several attendees circled around her, expressing shock that the county would offer Hambley so much money. An older man who wore a Navy veteran cap and balanced on a cane asked her, quote, are they really going to give her $4 million? End of quote. A woman with an American flag scarf draped around her neck warned, quote, if you give in to one of them, you open the floodgates to them all, end of quote. A lawyer in a crisp Oxford shirt and khakis said, quote, I can't believe numbers like that were even contemplated, end of quote. Curran told them she didn't support the settlement and had planned to vote against it before it fell apart. She said, quote, I don't agree with it, end of quote. The board had spent more than 30 hours in open and closed session discussing what to do and seemed to have no workable answers. One of the commissioners resigned amid the standoff, citing changes in his personal and professional life. 6 of the 10 remaining wanted to remove Hambley. 3 were trying to find a way to keep her. Curran was somewhere in the middle. She said, quote, I'm so tired of the political games on both sides, end of quote. Oh, that might get her kicked out of Ottawa Impact for making a statement like that. You stay in lockstep or you're out. That's how it works with that group. The battle was affecting the health department's ability to keep staff and deliver services. Since the beginning of the year, 24 employees, about a fifth of its workforce, had retired or left for other jobs, according to health department officials. In the 5 years before the pandemic, the department had averaged about 8 departures a year. One of those who quit in November was Matthew Allen, a supervisor in the department's environmental division. He had been with the county for 14 years and described himself as a devout Christian who homeschooled his children, voted for Trump, and never got a coronavirus vaccine. He said, quote, none of that mattered to her, talking about Hambley. She was a wonderful leader, end of quote. Allen said Moss's interference had led him to leave the county for a state job. He said, quote, there's a line between government and religion, and when they get mixed up, you don't get people making decisions for the good of the whole, end of quote. His and other departures from the environmental division were taking a toll, health department officials said. The wait time for septic inspections in the county had tripled since January 30th to 30 days. The turmoil had also upended Ottawa Food, a health department program that helped feed 22,000 low-income residents each year. The board in the fall had eliminated funding for the program's director, a health department employee who coordinated food assistance with 45 local nonprofits and food pantries. In November, amid the fight over Hambley's fate, The nonprofits that made up Ottawa Foods Board announced they were suspending a program that provided aid to seniors and an initiative that supplied churches and food pantries with thousands of pounds of fresh produce. Rodea, the board's vice chair, accused the health department and its nonprofit partners of playing a political game with the program to discredit the commissioners. She said, quote, "We're committed to food security in this county, but we're not committed to dysfunction," end of quote. No, actually you are. You've committed dysfunction yourself, you idiot. The nonprofits on the Ottawa Food Board recently received $1 million from the county in November 2023 to run food programs and assist farmers. At a board meeting in late November, Rodea threatened to take some of that money and start a new county agency that would work more cooperatively with the commissioners. She didn't explain how the new agency would operate, but she did have a name for it: the Department of Family Impact. Moss, seated next to her, listened and nodded. He mused, quote, "A Department of Family Impact sounds really good," end of quote. The 2 weeks since Zylstra first raised the possibility of a truce had been turbulent for Hambley, the board, and the entire county. In late November, the 57-year-old Democrat called Hambley to discuss a matter related to the fight over the health department budget and the Ottawa food program. After a few minutes, the conversation shifted to the negotiations with the board over her future. He told Hambley, quote, "I'm feeling hopeful," end of quote. Hambley replied, quote, "Why? What's there to be hopeful about?" End of quote. Zylstra understood her pessimism. There had been stretches in the summer and fall when he'd felt like he couldn't talk to Moss and the other conservatives on the board outside their regular meetings. He worried that they might take his words out of context and use them against him. He said the strains mirrored the county as a whole, which he described as broken, before pausing to reconsider. He continued, quote, "I don't want to say that. We're separated into parts," end of quote. The tension had also spread to his relationship with his sisters, who were strong supporters of Moss and his movement. Yet Zylstra also believed there were reasons for optimism. The intervention by the courts had so far dissuaded the board from firing Hambley. Hundreds of citizens had rallied to support her and the health department. Shortly after the $4 million settlement collapsed, Hambley's attorney, Sarah Howard, filed a motion asking a state circuit court judge to enforce it, arguing that the two sides had reached agreement on the essential terms before the commissioners decided to back out. The board's lawyers countered that the deal hadn't been finalized and that the commissioners hadn't voted publicly to accept it. Both steps were required by law before the settlement was complete, they said. Judge Jenny L. McNeil, who had been dealing with the case for much of the year, scheduled a January 19th hearing on the matter. In the interim, she urged the two sides to meet with a mediator and try to reach a deal. She said, quote, "I think everyone, not just the parties, but the entire county, needs some resolution here," end of quote. Zylstra understood that the mistrust and anger in the county weren't going to be resolved by mediation or even the courts. The divisions were real and deep. Like many in Trump's Republican Party, Moss framed politics as a battle between good and evil. The nation's survival was at stake. Compromise was a sign of weakness and corruption. His perspective had inflamed passions across the county and upended the way the board operated. Zylstra said, quote, "We don't talk about whether we should plow the snow once or twice a day. Those are not our fights. Our fights are much larger," end of quote. But the past year and the standoff with Hambley had made it clear that there were limits to the board's power, limits that even Moss was being forced to acknowledge. Zylstra thought that the court-imposed delay might allow emotions to cool. He believed that eventually the board and Hambley would be forced to recognize that their only viable option was coexistence. Zylstra called it, quote, "an uneasy truce," end of quote. A trying year was drawing to a close. This was Zylstra's hope for the next one. And that is a very good summary of what has happened the last year in Ottawa County regarding the health department. Kudos to the Washington Post for publishing this article. All right, and before we go, let's get to our final segment.
Stop! Hammer time!
Oh, yes, it's hammer time. It's time to drop the hammer on the douchebag of the week. And this week's winner is a previous winner of the award, New York Jets quarterback Aaron Rodgers. Mr. Anti-Vaxxer himself. Mr. COVID is a hoax and is bullshit. Let's go ahead to this story. This is Joe Reedy writing for the Associated Press. This is dated January the 10th, but I'm going to go back to the beginning of where this story started. During a January 2nd appearance on Pat McAfee's show on ESPN, Aaron Rodgers implied that comic Jimmy Kimmel's name might appear on a list of associates of Jeffrey Epstein, the millionaire accused of sex trafficking involving underage victims before he, quote-unquote, died by suicide. I don't think he did commit suicide. I think he was murdered because there were a lot of prominent names on there. So last week, Tuesday, Aaron Rodgers' appearances were announced to be over on the Pat McAfee show. McAfee announced at the beginning of his Wednesday show last week on ESPN that his fourth season of doing a weekly segment with the New York Jets quarterback had ended. As his staff applauded in the background, McAfee said a lot of people would be happy to hear that news, including himself. McAfee, who was a former NFL player himself and former WWE professional wrestler, said this, quote, "With the way it ended, it got really loud. I'm happy that it's not going to be in my mentions going forward, which is great news. We were very lucky to get a chance to chat with him and learn from him. Some of his thoughts and opinions, though, do piss off a lot of people, and I'm pumped that it is no longer going to be every single Wednesday in my life, which it has been for the last few weeks," end of quote. Rodgers' implication to Kimmel escalated a long-running feud between ABC's late-night star and Rodgers. It also proved embarrassing for the Walt Disney Company, the parent company to both networks. On Tuesday, Rodgers denied that he implied that Kimmel was a pedophile and condemned those who do, but he stopped short of apologizing for the earlier comments. Rodgers said, quote, "Any type of name-calling is ridiculous, and I'm not calling him a pedophile, and neither should you," end of quote. Which is basically his way of, yeah, you should. That's a dog whistle to conservatives. Like an idiot like Aaron Rodgers. Rodgers criticized Mike Foss, an ESPN executive who oversees McAfee's show, for saying that Rodgers had made a, quote, "dumb and factually inaccurate joke," end of quote, about Kimmel. Rodgers said, quote, "Mike, you're not helping. You're not helping because I just read earlier exactly what I said. This is the game plan of the media, and this is what they do. They try to cancel, and it's not just me," end of quote. The previous week, Rodgers said a lot of people, including Jimmy Kimmel, are really hoping that a list of Epstein's associates doesn't come out publicly. Kimmel, who has denied any association with Epstein, threatened Rodgers with a lawsuit for the comment and said the NFL star was putting his family in danger. Rodgers suggested that people were reading too much into what he said and that he was not stupid enough to accuse Kimmel of being a pedophile. Really? No, Aaron, I think you are that stupid. Kimmel said, quote, "A decent person would apologize, but he probably won't," end of quote, referring to Aaron Rodgers. Kimmel called Rodgers hamster-brained and said that he got 2 A's on his report card. They're both in the name Aaron. Kimmel added, quote, "It might be time to revisit that concussion profile, Aaron," end of quote. So once again, to Aaron Rodgers, we have this message for you.
Don't be a douchebag.
Yeah, you got that right. Yeah, hey, Aaron, you better worry about your Achilles tendon and your other injuries before you decide to go after an upstanding human being like Jimmy Kimmel. Because, Aaron Rodgers, you're not upstanding. You're more like sitting down, eating all that conservative crap. It's going to infest your soul. It already has. It's taken you from sanity. You're not sane anymore, buddy. There's the truth. Folks, that's going to do it for this week. We'll be back next week. I'm Darren Gibson. Please support independent media, the First Amendment, and a woman's right to choose.
The stations that carry Southpaws do not necessarily share the opinions expressed on the show. Southpaws is protected by the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and is copyrighted by Big D Entertainment. All rights reserved.